Hi, everyone, and welcome to Psychic Perspectives. We are doing a series called Life Lessons Learned Through Mediumship, but these life lessons are for anybody. It's not just those who wanting to develop or connect with mediumship or are mediums. These are life lessons that are important to all of us. So if you're on a spiritual journey and you're interested in learning more about what we've learned through mediumship experiences, be sure to like, subscribe, and join us. So let's get started. All right, everybody. So we're going to dive into now the personality versus the soul, because that's what this life lesson is all about. And I think last time we really liked the format of kind of diving into kind of some of the channeled material that I had gotten, and then kind of let that guide us in terms of our discussion. So we're just going to get right out the gate by doing that, and then we'll dive into the discussion. As always, there's a link down below where you can download the free PDF of the channeled lesson. So if you want to have it for yourself or read along, feel free. All right, so let's begin. And it says, when we think of our personality, we must think of it as an aspect of the soul. But the personality is not and never will be the fullness of your soul. You might think of this concept as the sun. The sun is the wholeness of your soul, full of bright, beautiful, and perfect light. The personality, however, is a mere ray of that sunlight. It's a portion of the whole cast out into the far reaches of space. But with each band or ray that is projected outward, there is only a fraction of the fullness that is the sun soul behind it. When we give way to the sun as the soul concept, we begin to see that the sun or soul is so vast that it is capable of manifesting many various rays of beauty. This comes in the form of various lives and incarnations, but also other experiences and aspects that one need not worry about at this time. So I'm just going to pause. And as I was reading that, for those of you who are watching, we put up a little video that kind of shows a sun. And as you looked at it, you could see all of these different light rays coming off. Some of them were pink, some of them were blue. And I thought that this was a beautiful representation of the core of the sun being our soul. I love that about this lesson. And each ray is like a projection from the sun. It's not the soul itself, right? It's not the sun, but it is a byproduct. It's the light of the sun. And each one of those rays is its own unique being. So what thoughts about that? And does that visualization kind of work for you as far as your concept?
Yeah, actually, the sun, I think, is a really good way of kind of describing that which is your higher self. And the especially like the multicolored one, because I feel like that also represents like the fractals of it, where you know, each ray of light is separate, like you're talking about, and the
Right.
colors kind of represent that in the rainbow, where the rainbow literally is the fractal of light. So I don't know if I'm saying that right, but
No, right. Yeah. I just was curious too, if this kind of represented your point of view, and I believe that it did, but I agree with you. I really liked the way they described this. So I think it's a very simple concept just in this very beginning 2 paragraphs. Our ego, our personality is just a fraction of the wholeness of who we are, and you're right, those light bands, we have lives where we're male, or lives where we're female, or lives where we're this ethnicity or this culture. We had lives where we were positive and helpful, and lives where we were probably, the antagonist, or the protagonist. So we have all of these different aspects that come out. Yes, very
right.
true.
And each ego self is just that. It's a individualistic fraction of the higher self.
Absolutely. Yes. So I'm going to go on and begin reading the next section, and then we'll talk a little bit more, because I know there's a lot more to discuss on this topic. And so it moves on to say, it's like, you may fear death will erase who you are, and yet the ray that is your personality can go back to its source. This source is a divine creation, by the way, and therefore cannot be anything but perfect. Nevertheless, the soul is also bound to various experiences and aspects so that it can create and learn and grow and expand and even serve others. This does not mean the soul is imperfect, only that it too is part of something greater, an even larger sun that we might call God or the divine. In this way, your soul or your sun is also a mere ray of the sun that is God.
Right. Okay. I was
I
just gonna
love
say.
that. Yes, you and other divine beings are all rays of God. This makes you perfect and yet also not the fullness that is God. As you expand your soul, it becomes more and more into that which God desires it to become, giving greater service and so on and so forth. It is an eternal creation, your soul, not one that perishes. So that was really packed. And as I was reading that, we put up another video, and that one was just kind of this beautiful, bright, white in a bluish background sun. But what I liked about it were all these little smaller kind of like stars and sparkles, which
Yes.
really represent who we are. We're all
Yes.
these little sparkles of God. And we talked about this in other videos. People say, I am God. And I'm like, yes, but you're not the sum of
The
God.
God.
You
Right. It's
are
not.
of God.
Yeah. With the big G.
With
It's
the
yeah. It's
yeah, you're a ray of God, and I like
right.
that. But this is a very packed statement, and I know that we had some viewer questions that have come up, some of the preempting some of the things that we're going to be discussing,
Right.
asking, well, what
Right.
about this and what about that?
Yeah.
Because we shouldn't fear that death is going to erase who they are, is what they're saying. And yet the ray that is your personality can go back to its source. So that raises a lot of questions in mediumship, right? When we're connecting in mediumship, what are we connecting with? Now, I know my answer to that, but do we want to dive into that now and discuss that and say, what are we connecting with?
Oh yeah. I mean, definitely, because I think there's multiple aspects to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that I wanted to bring up was a particular meditation that I had where, I kind of had this concept already about the oversoul and the ego, and this is being your higher self. And I think it's a concept that we can all maybe kind of grasp. But when I had this particular meditation, there was a deeper level understanding that came with it,
Mm-hmm.
where what you're talking about with the little stars being this tiny fraction of God, but to you, this little star of tiny fraction seems like the oversoul.
Yes.
So, or it would seem like God. So in the beginning, like when I started meditating and stuff, I was kind of shown like another version of myself, which I thought was weird, but it's like an ego higher self, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of maybe is symbolic of, if you met you, would you like you? And if would you want to sit down and have a conversation with you? I think some of that was involved, but I think that the bigger picture was that your ego, you need to be connected to your ego higher self,
Right.
just as much as you need to then understand there's another
A
level,
layer to that. Correct.
right, which
Right.
is your oversoul, which is also connected. So when we're connecting in
Mm-hmm.
mediumship, you're connecting to all of these things, but on different levels. And yeah.
No, I think that's beautiful. No, you're right. You're right. That's a really good way of putting it. And we
Right.
have shared this diagram, and I'll put it up again, where we're showing the ego, the higher self, and then the soul. And I love that you said that, because if we think about that, you think about, the sun is projecting that ray, and we are the ray. We're out there living on the tip where the light is kind of hitting the earth, right? This is where we're at. We're at the tip of the ray, right? We're right
Right.
here. But
Right.
as we move back to source, back to our soul, it's kind of like we're still here. The ray is still here, but our consciousness is diving back towards source, back to the sun. And the closer we get to that sun source, the more we move into, you're using the word oversoul, but the soul, the highest part of who and what we are, that
Right.
creation of the divine.
And funnily enough, right before we started this, I did hear something about um this, what you just said, this equals the distance between you and God. So meaning that if you haven't even connected with your higher ego self, that will explain your distance to God. Now, if
Mhm.
you start to connect with that higher self and realize you're a part of
Beautiful.
another
Yes.
higher self,
Yes.
which is like God, but it is not the God with a big G. This is getting back closer to source.
Mhm.
This is the distance, okay, that I think a
Well,
lot of
that's
people
why
talk.
you heard it then, because that's what I was.
Yeah,
But you're
right.
right.
So,
That's again, that's another beautiful way of thinking about it. And so the higher self is kind of like, we're not, I think as long as we're a pinpoint of light, or as long as we're an ego here on the earth, there's that higher self of us, which is, we're not quite aware of the soul, but we're aware that there's a higher aspect to ourself. So I think
right.
it's kind of like we're getting out to the surface of the sun, so to speak, but we haven't really touched the soul. And I
Yeah,
think it gets harder because we are an ego. The point is, our consciousness is designed to be on the earth having this experience. But we certainly, and I like that distance, that we get closer to our soul, to the perfection. And it talks in
right.
here about, and I love that, the source, meaning our soul, is a divine creation and therefore cannot be anything but perfect.
Yes,
And you hear
yes,
mediumship saying, you hear people in mediumship saying, but the soul is perfect. And it is, but the ego is not. There's
right.
a difference.
Yes, yes,
And the
big
ego
time.
chooses to have experience that is imperfect so that it can continue to expand and move into greater God awareness, because
Yes,
it's the imperfection that we experience which teaches the soul, which even though it's perfect, greater expansion. Does that make sense? And
yeah,
you're right, it's
absolutely.
distance. It's
I
like,
kind of think of it as like, how many lives maybe have we all lived? Could
mhm,
be, could be a lot. I mean, I don't know. Could be unlimited amount of lives that
mhm.
your higher self, like the oversoul self, could
Mhm.
project out into egos
Right,
over
you think of a
time.
sun, it has rays are going everywhere. That's the whole point.
Exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. So now all of those people, because they would be all different people,
Mhm.
is still a expression of you.
Right.
And all of those experiences, you're talking all of the knowledge
Mhm.
that you've gained over lifetimes
Mhm.
is not only stored, but also evolving in
Mhm.
this little tiny sun that is still a fraction of the bigger
Absolutely.
God.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Beautiful. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
want people to kind of understand that there's this perfect aspect of you, and this leads to a lot of other much more deep, much more deep. How about that for grammar?
Yeah.
to deeper philosophical questions, and we're going to be talking about some of those, but we just want to get the basic concepts out, because remember, this is kind of getting very conceptual. We're advancing through life
Yeah.
lessons. This one's getting a little more advanced because most people only see themselves as the ego, right? We see ourselves as here and now, and that spirituality in our soul is over there, and it's not something that we can connect with. But I like that light ray, and you're talking about that higher self, and the closer we move into our greater consciousness, the closer we are moving to that perfect aspect of ourselves that will
Yes.
help guide us through this imperfect experience.
Yes. Yes. That
So I
makes
don't I don't
perfect
know if
sense.
that makes sense or not, what I'm
Yeah.
saying there. Yeah. Okay, so let's move back into the little bit left on the channeled lesson here. As it continues, it says the personality, however, which is that personal ray on your soul sun, this aspect can die off if your soul so desires it. For some, continuing the existence of the personality will no longer have meaning, and so we may shed that skin like a worn out piece of clothing. It no longer serves us, and so we let it go. For some, however, the personality may still desire experience or need completion. This is as individualistic as there are countless beings in the universe. We can't say to you that this will happen or that will happen, for it is actually up to you. Now, we talked about this in the other life lesson videos, right? It's like, who judges us? What happens when we die? They're really expressing right here, we get to choose if the ego aspect gets to continue to have an experience, and it may not need that, right? So go
Right.
ahead,
And it
because I have a
kind
lot
of,
of questions about this one, but go ahead, because I see
right.
I
It
see
kind
you're
of goes back
churning.
to a little bit of what we talked about where, um, we judge ourselves. So who's judging us? We are judging ourselves. And if that includes your higher self, that is closer to God, judging, I guess maybe the ego self, there could be a point in time where that ego, like, let's say that ego expression is really bad, that it gets transmuted. And so, this whole idea of the transmutation thing, I think, is part of that, where some people think that anything really, really negative, just kind of gets sucked back in, transmuted, and then spit back out into something new, like a new soul or a new expression. It doesn't ever really truly die, because that's how energy works, is that it only changes form, it never ceases to exist. So I mean, in that way, what you're talking about makes perfect sense, because you would essentially be like, okay, these are the expressions of myself that have provided me with, the best insights or best learning lessons. They are not perfect. That's the whole point. But I can understand how some of them might get dissolved back into what we think of as source, in that way.
And that was one of the questions that one of the viewers had asked, had said, are we forced to like give up our ego? So let's say, for example, I'll just use myself, right? Or I die. And so does Carol actually disappear because that ego completely just dissolves and gets reabsorbed back into source? And I think that really depends on my perception when I get to the other side as Carol. Does Carol want to continue to have experiences? Does Carol want to reconnect with that soul self? It's not a death in terms of we're forced to let go of the ego. It becomes a relinquishing.
It would be a willingness. It would be a willingness. Yeah. If you thought to yourself, especially maybe people, this might be interesting for like people that have maybe committed suicide. I haven't run into this particularly, but for some reason it's coming to mind, where it's like, if this particular expression really tried to end their life so hard, maybe they would be willing to shed the ego self and kind of, I guess, put it to rest. I mean, I'm not saying that happens with everybody, but it could be, I guess, a possibility or an option where, you just kind of put the restart button,
It's tough to know. I mean, these are all kind of subjective, because it depends on our mediumship, and different mediums will tell you different things, and so I get that can be difficult and it can be challenging.
I think if you were going to kill off one of your ego selves, it would be it wouldn't, there would be no sadness about it. It wouldn't.
Yeah, I don't like the word kill off though. Because I think that makes us feel like
it is essentially what's the word? It's like,
well, they use the word in here. If it no longer has no meaning, we may shed that skin like a worn out piece of clothing.
Well, there you go.
I mean, it just doesn't serve us anymore.
Exactly.
And we go, I get to the other side. I've evaluated my life. I went, wow, she was nuts. Wow, she did some good stuff. Wow, I really need to process all of this.
Yeah.
I've made peace with those experiences as Carol. And I go, okay, I kind of feel complete. What's the next step? you know, and that next step might kind of be me as Carol as I know myself. It's like when you stop being a teenager and you become an adult. You don't stop being you. You just aren't in high school anymore. You're not a teenager anymore. You've moved into a new experience. So there's still that part of you that's there,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's just evolved. And you're
Exactly.
okay
Exactly.
with that. There is a, if you're not ready to let go of the ego, it's not going to fall away until you're ready.
Most people, I don't think, are ready to let go of the ego. And I think that's going to be a really hard concept for a lot.
It is.
Um,
It is.
and I think that that's a big fear, in fact, for people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
I think if it was gonna happen, it would be because of things like you said, like it doesn't simply need to be there
Mm-hmm.
anymore. It would probably be up to the ego a lot. Um, Depending on the situation. That would be totally individualistic. I don't know about that, but I definitely have heard the concept before as far as
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, I guess going back to source and starting over again, or even becoming, instead of, it's like shedding the ego and then becoming kind of like a consciousness that's not trapped in a body. I don't know how to explain that other
Mm-hmm.
than
Right.
if you were so spiritually evolved that you could handle that kind of concept of just being consciousness instead of the ego,
Right.
um,
It's
that might
difficult because
be
we're attached to our ego, right? It's like
right.
there's still that fear of I won't be me anymore. And it's like, no, you are you. You're just a more evolved you. It's like
Right.
you're ready to kind of leave that part of you behind, but you're still it's still because it's all you. That's
Right.
the
Well,
shit.
because I've heard
Your
of
soul
some
is still
people,
you.
right. I've heard of some people who have said that, like, the person on the other side has expanded to a certain extent, or what it is that you as your ego higher self can kind of I guess experiment with these types of experiences where you
Mhm.
can understand what it's like to not be attached to a physical self. And I'm talking physical self like your body, like,
Mhm.
when we pass, we're gonna still see our physical self as we were. This would be like the opposite, where you're just kind of expansive and um literally energy, like just kind of
Right.
spread out kind of thing. I
Right.
don't know, but
I understand what you're saying, but we're
I
trying
think
to
that's
verbalize a very esoteric type of concept to people. And unless you've had the experience through
I
either
know.
mediumship or a meditation, like you've said, and I'm going to give some examples of connecting with soul versus connecting with ego, and I want to talk about those in a minute. But it is a difficult concept until you've had that experience, I think, for
Mhm.
yourself, and then you kind of start to go, wow, because you feel it, right? How
Yeah.
often have we said, do the exploration yourself? You don't have to take our word for it. We're sharing you the things that we've learned through our experiences, but then go have your own experience, right? Well, let me get back because there's just a couple of paragraphs left and it continues to talk a little bit more about the personality. So we'll go there and then we'll dive into some of these other questions.
Okay.
So the channel part goes on. It says, we need not fear the loss of the personality, however, for it is much like when you change who you are as you grow into a new person. Oh, they're using the teenager example. As a teenager, perhaps you made foolish mistakes and then one day decided to grow or change. In the same way, the personality may no longer be an ideal candidate for the soul to utilize, and as such sets it aside. There are greater things you can aspire to, but this does not mean the essence of the personality is completely gone. It exists like a shadow, something you can don when required. You can revisit your youthful self, for example, or reach out to a loved one in your personality. These rays of who you are and who you have been never disappear. They simply return to you and your son's soul, or rather, they are always a projection of that beauty that is your soul. You are perfect, and in that perfection, you desire to grow and expand. This physical life shadows that desire to grow and expand, and then takes back to the soul all that it requires, feeding it as the sun feeds the earth. Without the personality, the soul is stagnant, and without the soul, the personality does not exist. And that was the end of the lesson. And I thought it was so beautiful. So it kind of addresses right there. Your soul is in you right now. So there's no way you can ever not be you, but you will see yourself in a new way, right? You will be more than what you think you are right now. We're just so attached to this clothing that we have on that we feel that it's the only thing that we have to hang on to it. And if we let it go and lose it, we're no longer ourselves.
Right.
But that's not true. It's an evolution. It's a growth. So,
Yep.
so that kind of ends what the channel lesson was, but I think it was very rich in explaining the very simple difference between soul and personality and what happens in that choice and that freedom.
Mhm.
So did you have any thoughts about this last section? Nothing come up for you? If nothing stands
The
out,
only
that's
thing that
okay.
came up was kind of about the other meditation where it was but it was it was a healing meditation that I did really recently actually too, and something that I kind of thought would go with this is the idea that your your life right now is really super important. Like everything that you're doing right now in your physical life is literally helping not only you right now, but your past self and your future self, and everything that you accomplish, learn, heal, grow, is also having this ripple effect on all of your other ego selves that we're talking about right now. So I kind of wanted to, I guess, bring it back to the present where it's like, you know, this incarnation, this ray of light that you are right now is the most important because we're conscious in it right now.
Right.
So everything that you do now, because that's the only thing we have control over really too.
That's right. That's right. We are this ray in this moment. So we have to be that.
Right. So as long as you're making the best of that, that's going to have this ripple effect out into all of your other ego selves. And that was something that came up, and time is irrelevant in that space. So, you know, healing myself now, I was looking at my past self and my self now and my future self, literally zipping off like this, shedding this whole layer of skin, like a whole person
getting
just
rid of the
came
suit,
off.
right?
Right. So symbolically, that's it's like a layer, and the more like layers of stuff that we get through, learn, push through, etc., that's what we're here for, essentially.
No, that makes sense. And what I like about you sharing that meditation too, and the sun analogy is, and I don't want to get too far off on the topic because this is another topic, but what happens is when the sun exudes rays, our lives are not linear, they're simultaneous. And the sun is a perfect example. That's why I love this. If you're looking at the sun and you're seeing all those rays, those are all the other lives. Time exists for us because we are in the single ray. So we see each one of those as somewhere else, right? As a previous existence, or maybe we were, because if you listen to this channel lesson, it talks about not just lives and incarnations, but other experiences. And I had a feeling, we might be experiencing something on a different planet or in a different realm. So there's all of these different experiences that we're having. They're all happening at the same time.
Essentially.
So we can't conceptualize that because we're very linear. But if you think about that, your soul is having all of these other experiences, and each experience from the ray that's going into the soul, you're right. It's like it's this swirling ball of energy. If you think of the sun, it's constantly shaping and evolving and growing. And so when that meditation says, when we heal and affect this, we're affecting the energy of the core of our sun.
Yep, exactly.
And that core, as it becomes brighter and stronger, it gives power and energy to those other aspects as well, because everything is all interconnected. And I love that. That's why I really like this sun comparison, because we need to realize the lives aren't, well, I'm going to have to live this life because this one is bad, or so on and so forth. We're always balancing. We're always shifting that core of the sun, but these other lives are already taking place.
Exactly. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So in terms of mediumship, I wanted to give a couple of examples because this debate exists in mediumship, and people will say, when we pass, we automatically become the soul. The only reason that we connect with the ego is because the sitter, the person in front of us, needs to hear from their loved one. They don't care about hearing from the soul. You know, if my father connects with me, I want to know him as dad. Right? I want to hear the ego because the ego is what my ego misses. So why do I need to hear from the soul aspect? So that raises the question, are we connecting with the soul, which is projecting information about the ego, which is my dad? Or is my dad still really my dad having experiences on the other side? That is a great philosophical question. And I know everyone has an opinion about that.
I have an
And
opinion.
and I'm like, so what's yours?
It is a great question because there have
Mhm.
been times where, you know, you really do feel like you're connecting with like a higher version or better version of one's ego self.
Mhm.
And I think it kind of goes back to the analogy that I used earlier about the distance between you and God, right?
Mhm.
So it might not be just the fact that I want to connect with my father on the other side and connect with his ego. It might also be that that ego self needs it too. And even
Mhm.
though they're all,
Mhm.
because it's
Mhm.
still all connected. So
Mhm.
it's,
Mhm.
you know, you're connecting with the higher ego self, which is that is my dad, but he's also connected to his higher self now in a much more closer way
Right.
than before. So those could be interchangeable, but for his ego self and myself, this is where the magic of healing happens, right?
Absolutely. No, that's wonderfully said. Yes. 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 That makes
So I
sense.
think it would depend on the individual
Mhm.
situation,
Mhm.
who you're actually connecting with. Are you connecting with the ego self?
Mhm.
And I will just say ego higher self, because even living people, like for example, when I am in astral, you know, I've done healing on you a few
Mhm.
times, and
Mhm.
when I'm connecting with you, I'm connecting with the ego Carol. Okay, it's your spiritual, your ka, whatever you want to call it, um this ego higher self, but it's still Carol. But are you aware of that? Not necessarily, because this is something that's like
Mhm.
in the ethers. And
Right.
depending
Mhm.
on how connected you are, or um sensitive, I guess one person is,
Mhm. Mhm.
they might know, for
Mhm.
example. And I've done meditations where you know, the validation was there, where it was like they could tell that I was there, or they could
Right.
say that I was there.
Mhm.
And depending on, like I said, how connected that person is, will depend on, you know, how much they will maybe notice that. But the same aspect applies in mediumship, as far as who we're connecting with. We're connecting with this higher ego self,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
9 times
Mhm.
out of 10, that's
Mhm.
who comes forward.
Mhm.
um but some of the higher wisdom that comes from them a lot of times is from their soul and
Mhm.
from their higher knowledge, because they also claim to not have all the answers about God and the
Mhm.
universe, for
Mhm.
example, because we can
Mhm.
never be outside of that state to really look in and understand it. We're
Mhm.
always kind of subjective to it and going with the flow.
Mhm. Nope, that makes sense. Now, it makes sense to me. Now, whether or not it makes sense to everybody,
Hopefully it makes sense.
we hope that
Yeah.
it does. But you're right, because there are times when the ego passes and it's still resolving issues from the physical life, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think that creates this awareness that we still have free will. You know, each one of these rays that are our soul still has free will. We don't lose that, right? God gave the soul free will, and so the soul has all these experiences, but each of those experiences doesn't lose its free will. It's not like,
Right.
okay, I'm done with you, I'm going to kill you and call you back into the herd. That isn't what's taking place. It is
Yeah.
a projection of you, but it has its own life to live, so to speak. Because I know that, you know, I've connected with family for you, and sometimes they will come through and they're needing to heal. They're needing to still process their life, right? So that's the whole point. If we think that the soul or the ego dies, it becomes that higher self that you're talking about, right? It's a little closer to understanding now that it's out of the body. Okay, wait a minute.
Yeah,
I got a different perception about things than I had when I was over here and down at the very tip of my ray. So we've
exactly.
kind of moved that ray back up. That's that distance that you were talking about. If you think about the ray as this line going back to the sun, when you dip out of your body, you've moved closer on that ray back to source. But you
Exactly.
don't just go from here to the tip all the way back to source, and then
Exactly.
source all of a sudden just projects the ego back to the sitter.
Not
That's
yet.
not my belief because it's
Right.
not been my experience.
It's
But I
connected. It's connected, but it's still separate.
it's on that spectrum. So let's say the, family member passes and they realize, oh wow, okay, there's something more to all of this than I realized, but I need to atone. I want to connect with my loved ones. I need to apologize. I need them to forgive me. I'm still processing the physical life. So I'm not going all the way back to my soul because I'm still learning from that experience.
Right.
Why? Because I didn't learn it when I was here. So there's still value in the ego to the soul. Just because it's not
Absolutely.
in the skin
Absolutely.
suit anymore, that is my
Otherwise, what would be
experience.
the value in being able to connect with our past lives? And we've talked about it.
Mhm.
The value is if you're going to tap into your past lives, learn the lessons again, understand what their mistakes
Well,
were,
if we think of them
what you've already.
simultaneously, it's like you're tapping into other rays that are very related to what you're going through. Those are the
Right,
ones
right.
that are very similar to some of the dynamics that you're experiencing now.
Right,
So
but
you
it will
can,
if you haven't learned it, the cycle repeats, and that's the point. So, and again, it's also not about, oh, you didn't learn that lesson. It's about having further understanding in things and continuing to get better at it. Like, for example, love.
Mhm.
That's super difficult for people, and yeah, maybe you're a good person, but you still need to work on
Right.
certain things. So
Mhm. Mhm.
it's a constant evolution. um yes, everything might be happening simultaneously, but there's a reason why we're conscious in this linear moment now. And part of that is because there are some things that you either haven't learned or you already have conquered and mastered. And so by looking at the things
Mhm.
that you've
Mhm.
already
Mhm.
conquered and mastered, uh, you can understand where it is that you might
Right.
need to grow,
Right.
or
Right.
where your strengths are and able to push you along further into this life, because you're never going to be perfect. You're always evolving. And we don't know past, present, future as far as lives are concerned. Like, what if in a quote future life I'm actually living in a past time, to
Well,
because
that's the whole point. And it's, I know
so
we're going to talk about this in another show though, is like but they're all simultaneous. There is no past, present, and future. There's only
right, we're
now.
because we're going to talk more about time. And
Right. We're going to talk about time. Yeah.
yes,
And we're going to get
it's
into
fine.
that. So I'm not trying to take away from it, but I just don't want to get off too much off the ego because that's kind of what we were talking about. But I get your point, I think, is that you're trying to say is that you're right. We can tap into those other energies. I mean, I've had past life awareness, and what I find really interesting is like there's a theme in these other lives that I've been made aware of. And it's to
Yes.
recognize what's the theme in that life. What can I gain from this other aspect of my soul, which is having this experience in theory now, right? Even though
Right.
even though it's in a different timeline, it's like we're all having these same very similar experiences, but in different ways. So how can I
Right.
take that
But again,
knowledge? Mhm.
being conscious in this life, if I'm able to, it's like, if I'm able to heal a past or future lifetime by um healing myself now, then now
Mhm.
is where your power is, and now is
It
the
is because
most
you're
important
healing your
thing.
soul, you're healing your core. And when you heal your core, that gives more power to those other incarnations if they choose to utilize it. And I think that that's an important
That's
aspect too,
that's a good
because
point.
I could choose to absence myself from my soul. And that is very possible, right? We
Right.
can move further away from soul. And that's where we think of negative people, negative experiences. We still have a soul, but it's a distance. I love
It's
that you brought
yeah.
that up. It's a distance again. We're even
Mhm.
further removed from the notion that there even is a soul. We become further entrenched in this life and what we can get and take from it. And that
Right.
becomes even an even greater absence from God, because we've
Exactly.
thrown ourselves so into the ego, into the moment, that we don't realize there's something else out there. And
Right,
we've
right.
disconnected from the divine in others.
Right. So there has to be balance in both.
Mhm.
It's like, understand there's bigger concepts
Mhm.
and timelines and everything's happening at different times, but that your power is here in the moment now. But then, like you said, don't get too stuck in the whole, you know,
Right.
now thing either.
But I think, as we talk about these life lessons, I guess the big thing is, okay, so this is really cool, but what does any of this mean for me? And I think some of it is about understanding that you have a soul, that the soul is perfect, but you're having an ego experience and it's imperfect, but it's designed to help expand the soul. And the soul will expand as a result of our experience. And the more we can kind of recognize this very vastness to who we are, the more we can bring that into the now, which really isn't bringing it, it is bringing it into the now, but it's about us connecting back up into that channel, into our consciousness, into our higher self. And getting back to the mediumship too, is like, I want to go all the way back to where we were talking about family coming through and still processing. And I know this has come up with people that have committed suicide. And, you and I did a reading recently where there was a couple of individuals who came through and they were in very different places and very different spaces.
Yeah.
One individual was still processing the physical life. So the
Right.
ego still had value to the soul. The ego or the soul was still learning. So follow me here. I know you are, but I want to be sure people that are listening are. Body's gone. It's not in the physical dimension anymore. The ray of light is kind of moved closer to the soul, which means there's greater perception, but it
Right.
hasn't gone all the way back to the soul. It's still experiencing its ray self. It's just not doing it in this dimension. So now we start looking at these rays as kind of having all of these options for where do I want to experience myself? What are these other dimensions that I can experience that ego, right? Let's call it
Mhm.
Carl. Carl is no longer in physical body, but Carl died. So he's closer to the soul. But Carl says, there's still a lot of learning I want to do. The soul and Carl are kind of having this subconscious agreement. And
Right.
Carl says, nope, I still need to deal with this experience a little bit more. There's more for me to learn. Now that my perception is different, I want to process this. I want to work on that. The soul is still the ray that is Carl. Carl just
Right.
didn't die and go all the way back. And I think that some mediums disagree with that. And I guess that that's okay
I
because
don't know. I mean, because I guess it's kind of based on perception of
Mhm,
what they maybe saw, which, again, like I said before in meditation, kind of having a concept of this already of like an
mhm,
oversoul and an ego
mhm,
self,
mhm,
and
mhm, mhm.
not maybe really understanding the importance of that oversoul part where I think when we're talking about sacred geometry and the flower of life, and they talk about collective consciousness and stuff like that, like each little star that we were talking about that is you, this is what makes up our collective consciousness.
Right, right.
And then
Yes.
when you expand again, what you have is that collective consciousness, which is all of us, now are another, it like goes into another star kind of thing, and then that expands. And
Yeah.
so when you start talking about the vastness of the universe and how many collective consciousnesses
Right.
we have,
Exactly. Yes.
it's
Right.
it's ridiculous. There's so
It's
much, it's infinite.
overwhelming. It's overwhelming. It's just like we can't we can't fathom the number of galaxies and stars and suns, that are in the universe. We just simply can't comprehend it. So we cannot comprehend the vastness of consciousness either. And here we are, the tip of our ray, living in planet Earth on this physical domain, and we're arguing about these concepts of soul and ego, and So it's like, it's very out there. It's very cool to understand it and get a glimpse, because I think that's all it is a glimpse of
I
what it
think
is
so
like.
too. Yeah.
But again, it's kind of bringing it home in terms of mediumship. So I want to give a couple of other examples here though, too. And as a matter of fact, I just, I did a reading swap last night with someone, and this person's loved one came through, and I knew it was a soul level connection. So there is, for me, this is my personal experience. People can take it or leave it. If I'm connected with the soul, I know the difference between connecting with the soul and the ego, because they're very different. They're very different. Okay. This particular individual last night died young. The body was physically unwell and failed, and then went on to the spiritual world. But in essence, they were done with the body. It was over. The experience was over as that ego. Let's just call it George, right? I'm just picking a random name. That's not the name. So, so obviously George had to come through to the sitter with evidence. I mean, we don't want to just go, oh, it's your, so-and-so soul, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that evidence still comes through, but the soul knows what information needs to come through to the sitter to verify that this is George, right? But then what happens is I can tell based on the connection, George is very advanced. George isn't really George anymore, right? And so this was a sitter who also was very far along in their spiritual journey. And when I made the comment and I said, this is a soul level connection, do you understand what I mean by that? And that sitter goes, yep, I understand. So not every sitter is going to understand that, because if you just lost your loved one, you've never been to a medium before, none of this stuff matters. None of this matters. What matters is I need to know that George is okay. And that's what's going to come through.
Right.
And I think the bulk of traditional evidential mediumship, that is what happens. We connect with the ego higher self. We connect with our loved one's ego to let the loved ones know that they're okay. But I believe that
Absolutely.
there's a spectrum on that ego when it passes as to where it exists on the other side. It's the same here. You ever run into somebody in the grocery store and their energy's just crap and they're really dark and they're really heavy and they're in a bad space? Or then you
Mhm.
run into someone who's really loving and kind, their vibration is different.
Yep.
That's how it happens in mediumship. There's a vibrational quality to the
Yes.
ego that comes through, at least for me, where I can feel that they're on a spectrum. They're on a spectrum of that ray of experience on their soul. They haven't just been absorbed back and they no longer
Right.
exist and they're only projecting. I know that some people feel that that is the case. That has not been what I have been shown or what I have been taught from spirit is the case.
Yeah. Ego doesn't die, like I said, like we've talked about. So
It can at some point, just like it did with George. George, like, nope, I'm done with that body. I'm good.
yeah, but body, I mean, you're saying body, but it's like, but his ego self still came forward because obviously there needed to
But the
be
ego self was
validation.
very, very close to the soul. It really wasn't
Right. But
attached to
that's
the ego
probably
anymore.
because, like what you said, he was more an evolved person. So
Right. He
that makes
just
perfect sense to
wasn't
me.
attached to that anymore. Now I've had the opposite experience happen, which I can't really verify, where there was a spirit that had a very traumatic physical life, passed, no longer in the body, but wanted to continue to be in that ego, but to have a new experience in that ego in a different dimension. So that'll really trip your mind, right? So, because if I have a traumatic experience, right? Let's say, for example, I go through a war and my ego here in the physical world didn't get to fully live the life that it wanted to. If that ego drops out of the physical domain and says, I really wanted this ego to have a chance, it might continue to live as that ego, let's call it Fred, Fred says, nope, I'm not ready to go back to my soul all the way yet. I want to have a different experience in a different dimension, in a different reality. That'll trip your mind, because
Yeah, no,
we can't prove those things. We can't prove
well,
them, but those have been some of my experiences. And I go, wow, I need to do
right.
more sittings that I can validate to be sure I haven't lost my mind.
I know. Okay, so again, when we go back to the distance of God, that is exactly what we're talking about. So that ego self that you're talking about, that would rather be or not coexisting, but existing in a different dimension as that ego
Same
self,
ego, right?
because there wasn't enough, or they felt like there wasn't enough. This other person, George, is like, no, I served my purpose.
Done. Yeah, I'm
Right,
good.
right. But it doesn't mean that, like I said, the ego has to project out in order to like, let the sitter know and give you some sort of validation that this
It's
is
still
indeed
their loved one, though. That's the point.
exactly.
It's
And
still
so
your, that soul is still your loved one. Yeah.
I think it would be based on perception of the medium in that situation,
Mhm.
where
Mhm.
maybe a different medium might be like, oh wow, he's just completely gone back to source. I don't know. But that is
It
kind
is
of a
perception of the
drastic.
medium. Yes, you're
Right.
right.
So that is kind of an example of a drastic difference between someone who,
Mhm.
is really close to God and this, certain
Mhm.
vibrational level of their higher self. And then somebody that's like, no, you know what? I need more time to
Mhm.
be in this expression, to learn more,
Mhm.
et cetera. I'm not ready. I'm not ready.
Right. Right.
And that's
Yes.
okay. There's no judgment there. So
Right.
that's
Yes.
really cool though. I mean, I haven't had that particular experience per se, but I have heard of souls living in another reality, whether it's, you want to call it a
Right.
dimension or time band
Right. Yeah,
or
it's different
you know,
words. You can call it what you want, but
right.
let's say I'm Carol and I'm tragically killed, and again, there's a tragic war, and maybe I agreed to it, right? Soul contract, which we're talking about next episode. Maybe I agreed to it, but at the same time, it was like, man, you know, Carol would have been really cool if she hadn't been killed. So I would like to go to a time band where that war doesn't take place, right? I want to have an experience where I continue to get to be Carol, and I want to do this. And I think that those possibilities exist. And I do believe in this channeled lesson that part of that is what they were alluding to in the very first paragraph, where they referred to different experiences, not just incarnations, but different experiences. So I
Yes.
think this is the point of understanding the personality and the soul, is this amazing spectrum of who we are. We're just
Yes.
so
Yes.
complex. It's like
Mhm.
the cells in our body. How many cells are in our body? Some make our heart, some make our lungs, some are our brain, some are our muscles, and each one of them is doing something very different. And they're
Mhm.
all living and they're alive and they got their little engines going, but each one of them is doing something different. But it's us. It's a
Right.
one us. So that's another comparison for your soul. It's like you've got all these rays, all these other lives, all these other experiences. Some of them are internal, some of them are external, some of them are in different realities and different dimensions. And it seems really trippy because we're just worried about the fact that we lost our loved one, and we just
Mhm.
want to know they're okay.
Right.
And
No,
there's
it's very
there's
interesting.
nothing wrong with that. That is the point of evidential traditional mediumship. But some people start to have experiences
Yeah.
that you may get on that spectrum and go, well, what happened here? And so there's a lot we can learn from mediumship and connecting with spirit and souls.
Definitely. Because again, every situation is always different. It's
It
always
is every
unique.
time,
Yep.
every time,
Every single time.
every time. And that's what I love about mediumship, is like, evidence, evidence, evidence. And then they'll come through and they'll say, you know, oh my gosh, your family members, they're doing the same thing now that they were doing when they were alive,
Yeah.
only
Yeah.
it's more perfect. They're happy.
I know, right? It's so
So
cool.
it's kind of like those experiences are still taking place if they're joyful and they're serving. We're so complex. We're so
Yeah.
complex. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of the point of this too, I think, is that we don't have all the answers as far as
There's
that is
no possible
concerned.
way. There's no possible
But
way.
like, this is what we've gathered so far.
Mhm.
Because,
Mhm.
like I said, recently, it's like, I recently had that like new aha moment about
Right.
like the vastness of that, which is collective consciousness,
Mhm. Mhm.
full of multiple collectives. So it's,
And that is, we are this life right now. We are a collective consciousness. Our soul
yeah,
is a collective consciousness. It is a collective consciousness of other incarnations, other
right,
lives that are
right.
happening,
And
other
see,
beings, other
so
realities.
that
We are
makes me
a
think
collective.
of like this like pattern though, where it's like you're a collective of your own consciousnesses and past lives,
Mhm.
and you're a part of this collective, which is
Right.
that which is us as human beings.
Right.
And then we're also part of this other like collective that
Right.
is a group of maybe humanoids, and then it just keeps getting
Right.
bigger and bigger and
It's like our
bigger.
guides are, they're their own souls. They've got
Right.
their incarnations. Maybe the part, maybe they haven't are
But
they haven't incarnated.
what's
It's very
great, and
different.
from my understanding, is that we are still all very connected. So no
Yes.
matter if we're talking about
Mhm.
like, let's say an alien consciousness that we don't really understand, we're still connected to it in ways that we have no clue about. So it doesn't take away the connection. It just means that, well, we're not really conscious about it.
Right. Mhm.
And
Very
so
true.
it
Right.
just, the more that you understand, the more layers you continue to have new understandings about. And
Right.
so this is
And
my
it's
understanding thus far.
yes. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no, no. And it's fascinating, but again, it's like it has to be real world application. And I think that's the point of, well, I'm curious about my other lives. And it's like, you may not be shown those because it's not beneficial. What matters is the here and now. What matters
Right.
is us expanding to our best potential, overcoming what we're here to overcome and manifesting what we're here to manifest.
Well,
That's
some
that's
people,
the point.
yeah, I think you'll be kind of maybe drawn to those things that you would need. Um,
Absolutely,
you
right, and
know,
that's the whole point. So what's gonna come to you is going to be relevant. So to say, "I haven't had that experience, so it must not be true," that's just not in my wheelhouse. I wanna be careful. I used to do that, and I learned the hard way, because I had to backtrack some things that I said I thought were, "No, that's not right." And I may backtrack some of what I'm saying next month because I get a new awareness, I get a new expansion. But
yeah,
based on where I am today, this is the way that I understand that.
right.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's important. So,
I want to cover one more topic before we move. And let's talk about the nature of an ego that has a pretty negative incarnation, right? So we can think of people, I know Hitler's the classic, right? But there are other people that have done some kind of crappy things. You can probably pick some people out in politics today, that are like, that person should go to jail, or they created a murder, did a crime. And we think of that as a pretty negative incarnation because let's face it, they were very far removed from any sense of soul. They might have not believed in life after death. They were very into the ego. They were very into consuming and using other people, because they didn't recognize the divinity in others, let alone in themselves. But they had loved ones. So it's always curious to say, I'm the mother of this person, perhaps who committed heinous crimes, but I still want to know that my child is okay. Is that loved one going to come through? Are they in purgatory? Have they been absorbed into hell? Um, my opinion is that yes, they're going to come through because they still have a family, they still have loved ones. But that begs us to ask, you used the word transmuting. Do they get absorbed? Don't they get absorbed? I know I have my thoughts on that, but what about you?
yeah, I mean, I have just heard that certain negative, and I will maybe just say entities for lack of a better term, um,
But we're
certain
talking about somebody that
people.
was an ego. So when you
Okay,
say,
so okay, we'll scratch entities then. For people who have died that were bad, that refuse to do anything else, because there are people that are like that. I still think it's probably very individualistic, but
mhm,
it doesn't mean that the people that ego self can't come forward because they're in hell or something. They may be experiencing their own hell, but
right,
that
which we
doesn't mean
talked
that they
about in the last episode, heaven and hell episode, right, right.
right, but that doesn't
Mhm.
mean that they can't come forward. And the other thing is that I'm pretty sure you get as many chances as one needs to, you know, level up, I suppose.
Right.
But there's a certain kind of evil that just, they don't care. They don't want to level up. They're particularly happy with destruction and this just overall evil that I guess I will describe it as. And eventually, I do think that those situations can end up being like, it's a transmutation. So meaning that that higher self, like you said before earlier, maybe it does just get transmuted and sucked back into source. Maybe not. Maybe they just sort of live out their ego hell for eternity. I think that that's still going to be an individual thing, but all I know is that there is some evil that it just, because it only wants to destroy, can be taken back into source, transmuted. But again, we're not trying to eradicate evil completely, because the yin yang, right? There has to be balance, and some things that we perceive as bad, circumstantial, however you want to put that, is a necessary catalyst and just a product of life itself. So things would be relative in that sense. What are your thoughts?
No, you know, very similar to yours. And I think when we disagree strongly. And when we agree. So, you know, I recently had an experience. I'm not going to mention the person who came through, you know, you and I talked about this a little bit, but this person had not been pleasant in life, was very narcissistic, was very into, it was about me, you know. And so when this person passed, this person was still in that mindset. That person didn't just suddenly become, oh, I'm my soul, and I was over here, I was a crappy ego, but it's all okay now, you know. And I struggled with that, because I knew that some mediums felt like, oh, but you know, we're all light, love and light, and we're perfect. And I'm like, but there are shitty people in this world. And I don't mean that they're 100% crappy, because I think all of us have redeeming qualities, but there are some people that are just, they're so dark, and they have some really bad intentions. And then especially if they have no belief in an afterlife, and then suddenly they are still alive, does that just suddenly dissipate? And I think the answer to that is no. We talked about that in Heaven and Hell. Their ego still is in this very narcissistic state, and is now furious that they're fueling themselves off of others, because that's what this individual did, fueling themselves off of others. There was no one to feed off of anymore. And that person was in their own state of hell, because there was no one feeding that person's narcissistic needs and tendencies anymore. But that ego was still alive as the ego. It wasn't transmuted. It wasn't sucked up into this beautiful, perfect, you know. And so I listen to some of these reputable mediums that I really respect, and I study and follow their work. And, you know, I even pay to take classes from. Everything is love and light, and it's perfect. And I'm like, gee, I just, that just doesn't work for me.
Not everything is love and light and perfect. I think the more people try to say that and sugarcoat things, it's almost like less credibility that they have in my eyes. Because
I don't want to say that. I think they're serving their purpose.
I will say, I just said it.
I think I'm going to disagree. They're serving their purpose. We just talked about that, because you said
perception. Okay,
we're only going to connect with what serves us. It is perception. Yeah,
it's perception. And I'm not going to sit there and say that because they didn't experience something that was negative, that their perception is wrong. But they like to turn around and say that, well, because I've experienced angels and demons, they haven't.
I understand.
That I'm somehow wrong.
No, that's right. And so if you look at this person who was a predator in life, do we just think that they pass on and they go, okay, I'm good now. I'm perfect.
No,
That's just not the way it
no.
works. Now, their explanation for that, I have to be in all fairness, because I'm not pointing fingers at any one person. I haven't sat down across a table and had a discussion with these people. So I don't want to undermine anyone else in this community. I think that's a part of being ethical here, is that mediumship work is sacred work. No doubt about it. And if this predator's family came, they want to know that their child, no matter what they thought that child did, they still love that child. It's still their child. They deserve a sacred connection. I'm okay with that. But I was reading Janet Novak's book again for the second time, Where Two Worlds Meet. She was just beautiful. For those of you that are mediums, you'll know who that is. I'll put a link down in the resources. And I thought, I felt very inspired to read her book. And right there in the introduction, I'm reading it again. She goes, when souls pass, they have to atone for what they've done. So this predator doesn't just get away with having been a predator and then everything's love and light and perfection. Something has to be atoned. Some might say, well, it's going to have a life as a victim, or it's going to have, I think it's more than that, because I think lives are simultaneous. I think it's having a life where it understands what it's like being a victim, but this life is as a predator. And that energy still has to be balanced out at some point.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know if I'm expressing myself well or not, but.
Well, I think, yes. I mean, I just,
it's just worthy of talking about the evil and negative experiences. And I hate the word evil, but what happens to those egos that are we just know that's a bad person.
Well,
at least in this life.
We've talked about it, and that's a relative term, because we're not judge, jury, and executioner. I mean, I'd like to be sometimes, but you don't want me in charge, because
Right.
I'll be, damning everybody to hell. I think the important thing to know is that there is a certain judgment on the heart, meaning that if you're not willing to face what you've done, you're not willing to atone for the things that you've done, then yes, you're going to be stuck in your self delusion created hell that you've made for yourself. Why? Because you deserve it. So I hope you have fun.
But I do think that for the majority of mediumship connections, they are just people seeking connections with their loved ones. And I do think that a majority of people are here living their lives and doing the best they can, and so a majority of those mediumship connections are going to be from those people who are just seeking connection with their regular everyday loved one.
Right.
And that's what matters. That's what matters. That's the healing that needs to take place for both the spirit as well as the person that's still here in ego. So I just wanted to bring that up, because we talked about transmuting and absorption and negative. And I know we talk about this a lot, but I think these are things that deserve to be considered. So.
Right. But again, if we're talking about a sun that is, the overall soul and then an expression of rays, you're still going to have different aspects of each individual that may or may not be absorbed, like kind of like you said. So I don't know, it's like the whole transmutation thing. So maybe this one particular ego expression was really bad. Is the next one going to be somewhat better, and then maybe balance it out. So
that's why I said I don't believe in that, because I believe that time is simultaneous. I believe that there's probably an experience that does balance that. That's why I said I think if this is a very negative predator, there's probably an incarnation somewhere in that sun ray that's the victim, because I think that's the balance that the soul has. But I don't think it's linear. I think it's a balance. At least that's the way it's been conveyed to me.
Right. I would agree with that. Yeah, definitely.
So somewhere in your, and that's why we go, well, why am I the victim? It's like, why did I have to experience that? Well, there's a reason, and it's very difficult from the ego level to understand what that reason might be, but it might've been that you were the predator. There's another aspect of your soul that's the predator. This is
right. We're going to talk more about that in soul.
Right. Yeah. And that's why I was like, I don't want to get too far into it, but there is a karmic aspect to that. because it is about balance. Most definitely. There's still a karma to it.
Right. That's why I think, certain people like that, and the individual in particular that you're talking about,
Mhm. Mhm.
it's not surprising that they're in their own
Right.
hell. It's just not surprising
But
at
when you think
all.
of this concept, though, it begs the question philosophically to say, so this person who was a predator when they were here, why wouldn't they just be absorbed, right? It's like, why would the
Because
soul, what does the soul benefit by allowing the ego to continue to be in this very narcissistic state, even though it's no longer in the body? What's the purpose of that?
it doesn't cease to exist, so it's got to do something, and
And
it
that
has.
was the way I understood it from this experience, is that because the ego still has free will, it gets to choose when it's ready to be back at the soul level. We're
Right,
here right now. We can choose to be as close to the soul as we want to be, as
right,
possibly as we can. We can drive ourselves in that direction. Just because we shed the skin suit doesn't mean we lose free will. We've talked about that repeatedly in every video. There's still free will. So my explanation for that is the ego loses the skin suit, still is in the ego. It has to recognize that it wants to move back to the soul. The soul just doesn't say, all right, you're done. I'm going to kill you and bring you back. It still gives that ray
right.
its own
So
free will.
I guess when we're talking about distance from God and rays and stuff like that, it's
Mhm,
like,
mhm.
okay, but the sunlight is now going into like the depths of the ocean where like the light isn't even shining anymore,
Exactly. It's
you
almost
know?
like it's almost like it's gone the opposite direction, right?
Right,
You're right. And it was like, how do you convey that? But that is exactly right. It's like we've become even more removed from the soul. It's almost like we've crossed that threshold to that's no longer over here, pain and suffering, right? Because a lot of us in living normal lives, it's about pain and suffering, and we hurt other people, but it comes from our pain. It's not really intentional. It's a byproduct of our suffering, right? But we're
right,
still on this side of the dark line, right? We're still over here, even though it's pain and suffering. But then there's that line that people cross, that it's not just, it's born of pain and suffering, but it moves into the intentional creation of pain and suffering for others. That intention shifts at that line, at that point, and that becomes even more removed from the soul. It moves it, like you're right, into the shadow side,
yep,
into the depths of, down into the bowels of earth.
yep.
That's why it's called hell.
Um,
That's why it's called hell. That's why we think down. That's why we think
right,
up. I think that these are very symbolic. And so
yeah,
I think the
but they
concepts,
make sense, and then
it
when you think about it, you're like,
does.
well, it makes sense.
It does. Exactly. But the intentions are very different. If I
Right,
accidentally hurt you because I was a hurt person, yes, we understand people that are in the purgatory realms, in the dark realms, across that line. We understand they're hurting. Hello, that's why they're there.
right,
But to believe that as an ego, they suddenly shift from, okay, I'm dead, and all of a sudden I'm all the way back up here again. That is not my experience. And you're shaking your head. That is just not my experience.
yes,
I
I
died. I was in the shadow line, right? When I was in my physical body, my ray only moved back to here. So I'm still in a state of hell. I'm just not in my skin suit anymore. But it's your fault. You're still going to be there because of the way you were.
yeah,
There is grace, there is love that still
yeah,
shines through all levels. That's the other illusion, right?
yeah,
Spirit permeates, God, love permeates all levels, but we have to climb ourselves back into that space, move to
right.
the soul,
So
to the divinity.
I mean, if that individual that you were speaking of were
Mhm.
to somehow um decide that they were going to turn a new leaf
Mhm.
or
They have to be ready to look at
whatever.
what they've
And
done.
right.
That's the
And
whole point.
I personally don't think that will ever happen. However,
Can't say.
miracles do occur. So I
Can't
won't say
say.
never,
Mhm.
but I don't know, my anger and my ego self says, I don't even care. That person deserves what they got.
But that's still a ray of a soul. And that's the part that's baffling, because that's still the ray of a soul that in other rays could be a saint, could be walking this earth doing
Right. And
amazing
that's where
things.
the unconditional love comes in, where it's like,
Mhm.
okay, well, I don't like the things that you've done. Okay.
But you're still a
But
soul.
if you were to make a different choice,
Mhm.
you could have redemption through atonement. And
Mhm.
that's the difference between,
Mhm.
I guess, wishing really bad on someone and then, kind of having this like unconditional understanding of
Right.
why forgiveness works for people who are like that, because it's a hard concept for me to
Mhm. Mhm.
wrap my mind around. I
Mhm.
want justice, I want
Mhm.
revenge, I want, those people that have hurt other people to suffer for what they've done.
I think it takes
And
a very advanced soul or ego to really be in that loving divine light, to look at that someone like that at the soul level. I think it's very hard when we're in ego to see the soul in another unless we're really deep in our own soul, right?
right. Well,
That's the divine gift,
I've
but it's
come across the
hard.
situation before, like I said, where,
Mhm.
I came across two child molesters in astral. And what were they doing? The same thing that they were doing in life. Did they have any kind of remorse or want to stop? No. So therefore, they got whatever they deserved in that situation. However, there was another situation that was very similar with a person that was doing similar things, similar horrific things. And they asked for forgiveness. They were like, oh my God,
So
please.
funny. I've had two as well, one that did not and one that did. And
So
it
it's a
was,
big difference.
it's choice, it's free will. You don't lose free will. You don't lose
Exactly.
free
And as
will.
long as you are willing to be honest with your damn self and
Mhm.
what you
Mhm.
have done in
Mhm.
life,
Mhm. Mhm.
you will have a chance at atonement. You will have a chance to redeem yourself. But the minute that you try to pass the buck onto somebody else, or
Mhm.
I guess just not take responsibility for those
Accountability is the word we use
accountability,
in
yeah,
other
then
videos. Right. Right. Yep.
you're gonna be
Right.
in the vibration that you're at for
Mhm.
as long as you still think that way. And for
Right.
as long as you still think that way,
Mhm.
that will be your fate.
Right.
End of story.
And I think it's perfect. I think you've summed it up and we've talked about it. But again, you can see how if you've been following and watching all of these life lessons, you can really begin to see how everything overlaps. And it creates this very perfect divine system, really. It's like we're accountable. You have free
Yeah.
will and choose wisely. That's the
Yeah.
end
Yeah.
result.
It's so
There is
important. I
there
mean,
is darkness over here, but there is the light of your soul that is created by God. You
yeah,
pick the direction that you want to go. And when the skin suit drops, the ego is still with you, but it's up to you how close you've gone to divinity or how far away that you've gone from it.
exactly.
I love your meditation. You said that was this morning?
No, actually, that was a few
Oh,
weeks
okay.
ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Because we
Yeah.
prepare for these ahead of time. Yeah, we
Yeah. No,
prepare.
this morning though, I got the distance
No,
thing.
that's what I meant. The distance one.
Oh
I'm
yeah,
like,
the
that's so
distance part.
perfect. I
Yeah.
love that because that is really the theme of today. So
Hmm.
you're very on point with that.
Yay.
All right. Well, I will wrap this up unless you have any last minute thoughts. I think we've really hounded this to home, but it
I've
does.
gotten myself all worked up.
We started off, it's like, all right, let's do this. And now we're like animated. We're into it. But I love this concept. I just want people to understand that they're not going to be dissolved upon their passing. I hope that we've given you some examples from our own mediumship experiences, our connections with spirit, that these are things that I've had to learn. I did not believe 99% of the stuff that I'm sharing with you today 15 years ago. I did not. These are things,
Well, I didn't either.
you know, these are things that I've had to grow into. And so I understand sometimes when mediums will say certain things, I can go, I can see where that person's coming from, or I can go, well, they're saying that because they haven't had that experience yet. And then I look over here and I go, you know, I haven't had that experience that that medium is talking about yet. But I'm at least going to consider what they have to say and go back to my
That's the
spiritual
lead.
guides
Yeah.
and say, show me, help me understand what this person is saying, rather than condemning that medium for being wrong, or even myself, asking for clarity so that we can integrate it into ourselves. So,
There's
yeah,
yeah, there's lots of concepts I think that I still ponder and
sure,
wonder
of
about. And I'm
course.
always open to hear what others have to say, even if it
Hmm.
doesn't fully resonate. So, if this
Hmm.
video doesn't fully resonate with you, that's
That's
perfectly
totally
fine.
okay. That's right.
Just
Don't take our
take
words for it.
whatever it is that resonates and
That's
leave
right.
the rest.
That's right.
But as far as being open-minded, you would think more people in our community would be open-minded, but um I've found that there are some people that they only grasp what they've experienced. That's fine, because
I
again, we're
think
talking about
it's
our own
natural
experience.
though. It's
We're talking
natural.
about our own
Right.
experiences right now.
Yes. Right.
And so this is our perception of it.
Right. It's our perspective,
So
psychic perspectives.
yeah, exactly,
It's
exactly.
our perspectives. But we have said time and time again, take it to your own team, take it to your own guides. Or like, well, I'm not a medium, so I'm taking your guys' word for it. Doesn't matter. You've got a soul. You're a creation of the divine. Start moving in that direction and
Right.
asking for that answer. You don't have to sit down and study theology books. You might watch a movie one day that goes, oh my gosh, that's the question I asked spirit. And they show you in a movie or a book or something comes along. Let the signs and symbols and answers come to you. Don't take our word for it. Take it to your guide, to your God, to your divine source, and allow that to imbue you, because
Yeah.
that's when it becomes
Like,
real for you.
did I yeah, it's like when I got really mad at Jesus one day, and I said, because I was mad about like terrorism and stuff, and I was like, raw, like, how am I supposed to not be angry about this
I
stuff,
know, I
And
know.
I mean, I literally 35 minutes later, Jehovah's Witnesses were knocking on my door with a pamphlet about how to not be angry. I was like,
Jesus said, come in your way, girl.
yeah. So when you say go to your team and ask for questions, like, yeah,
Ask.
go
Yeah.
ask,
Yeah.
ask your
But
own
pay
guides.
attention for the answer. And
Yeah.
you know, the other thing about asking too is I understand it's taken me again, my spiritual journey. I've had to grow into these experiences. I've had to grow into these awarenesses. If you ask a very advanced question and you're in the kindergarten, you're going to get an answer from spirit that you're going to be capable of understanding. Now, I don't mean that in an insulting way. A spirit is still
Right.
giving me experiences that are very basic because I don't understand yet. And so we have to build on concepts, just like we're building concepts for you on this life lessons through mediumship, and they're getting more complicated as we
Yeah.
go. Your spiritual team will start you
Right.
off with things that are simple and small. But if you're asking in a sense of sincerity, right? I do believe that those answers can and will come to you because we are seeking the divine, and the divine will always, always answer us. It is our responsibility to pay attention
Yes.
and to be willing to accept
In
what comes our
mysterious
way
ways, in
in
fact.
mysterious ways.
Yeah.
Yes, I love
In
it.
mysterious
So
ways.
I love it. So
Mhm.
thanks everybody for watching. We hope that you've enjoyed this. We hope that you stay tuned for the next life lesson learned through mediumship, because yes, we have a few more to cover. If you have any questions, we always appreciate that. Comments, likes, and subscribes helps us build our channel. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.